Hey guys, what's up? Welcome back to the channel. It's Cynicalex, and today I want to give you my list of the top 10 best leaderships in Marvel Future Fight for PvE content. Now, I want to make that distinction at the very beginning of the video. There's not going to be mention of PvP leaderships because unlike PvE, PvP leaderships are almost all the same. You almost always want the leadership that has when debuffed, remove all debuffs for X number of seconds. Now, Silver Surfer's is actually the best in the game because on top of the debuff removal, he gives you a 20% all attack, all defense, and a 1-speed buff for 12 seconds. But basically all of the other ones, Jean Grey, Doctor Doom, Strife, Angel, etc., they're all exactly the same, roughly. So it really doesn't have any meaning to include them all in this list in different categories or at different, rankings, number 10, number 9, number 8, etc. Wasp would be the only other consideration, and she's actually an honorable mention here because she has an all attack, all defense, all speed leadership, which is actually pretty good because it applies to every character in the game. And then her tier 2 passive is that PvP leadership. So because there's a lack of variance in PvP leaderships, I'm just not going to bother. Now, the criteria that I used for choosing the best leaderships in the game, as far as I'm concerned, again, this is just my list. This is not the only list. This is not the list that you must follow. But I considered the leaderships that had the highest bump in stats. So, 36% all attack is better than 30, which is better than 24. So the number is really important. And then the second thing that's also really important is how many characters does it apply to. So, for example, one of the honorable mentions that doesn't make the list, Mr. Fantastic, has an amazing leadership. The Fantastic Leader, 65% all attack is the highest in the game, or one of the highest in the game, but unfortunately it only applies to like 7 or 8 characters, so it just doesn't work on this list because applying to 8 characters is pretty meaningless for everyone else in the game. So I'm trying to consider the absolute best value leaderships. For that reason, you still have to use your own judgment when choosing leaderships. Mr. Fantastic is a great leadership if you're going to be using him day in and day out for certain game modes, but he just doesn't apply to other characters outside of the Fantastic Four and She-Hulk and Moon Girl and Thing, Crystal, so it doesn't really matter. The last piece of criteria that I used, the third piece, is that I did not consider any other buffs. So I didn't consider the tier 2 buff of the character. I didn't consider the uniform buff of the character. So, it would be unfair to say that Wasp has such a good leadership because of her tier 2 passive and because of her uniform bonus, because those are not part of her leadership. That's not part of the mastery for getting her, for using the Norn Stones on her stars. And so it really starts to confuse things if you consider all of that stuff. For example, Hela, her 45% energy attack is great, but she becomes even better when you consider her uniform passive for PvP and for PvE because it buffs damage against heroes for the, Scarlet Witch, Cable, Quicksilver world boss, but that's not part of her leadership. So I'm only considering the leadership. I will discuss in specific situations where certain characters are just way stronger when you start to consider those other things. But without further ado, I want to very quickly go through, we've already gone through Mr. Fantastic, all of the honorable mentions. These characters did not make the top 10 list, but they have very good, albeit more situational leadership. So we've got Magneto's 45% to all mutant allies. We've got Crescent's 60% physical attack to combat types. It's a bit specific. We've got Wanda's 45 energy attack to all allies. We've got Bishop, very interesting here. All allies get 24% energy attack and 45 energy defense. We've got the 40% mind damage for all allies for Kid Omega. We've got, again, the 65 all attack and the debuff removal for the Warriors of the Sky. This is probably the best leadership in the game, but it only applies to 4 characters, so it just can't be on the top 10 list. Star-Lord's got a 50% energy attack for only blast types. We've talked about Wasp. Electros is also really good. Sinister 6 get 40, 40, and 10, but it's only for the Sinister 6. Ghost gives Technokinetics 50% all attack, but you have to be Technokinetic, which means that gear icon in the machine, there's only about 15 characters that have that, so that's why that's why Ghost and Wasp are not on the top 10 list. White Fox and Dr. Voodoo both have the increased debuff effect and Enchantress. They are very, very situationally useful for like Sabretooth and Deadpool, but then they're pretty much useless for everyone else in the game, so that's why they're not mentioned. Iron Hammer is the #1 leadership for new players. Damage, more damage, lightning damage, and skill cooldown. I love it. It's just so good for new players. Victorious almost made the list, 35% all attack for everybody, and then Doctor Doom gets a heck of a lot more on top of that, so unfair. Medusa gives 42% all attack to universal types. Hydro Man, you weren't expecting this one. All allies get immunity to bleed, fracture, and physical defense. This might be useful one day when they buff up what bleed does in Marvel Future Fight. Ancient Ones, 45 energy attack to all allies. We're not considering the passive. Waves, leadership for Namor only. Ooh, very sensual. Goliath's leadership, the 45% all attack to, or sorry, 45% physical attack to all allies. Goliath has the same thing, exactly. Red Hulk's got the 60% fire damage and the immunity to burn, which is good in Shadowland. Titania's got the 50% physical attack to combat types, Enchantress we talked about. Ironheart's got the 45% energy attack to all allies. Lincoln's got the 60 lightning to all allies. Kid Kaiju, you didn't remember him, eh? 20% all attack, 20% all defense, 10% all speed to all allies. That's actually pretty good. Almost good enough for the top 10. Misty Knight's 60% cold damage to all allies. Blue Marvel's 50% all defense to all allies, which is very unique. We talked about Hela. And then Satana's 70% fire damage, and we are done. Now let's get to the top 10 list. Whew. So, coming in at number 10, you're probably not going to be expecting this one, but it's pretty simple. Moon Girl. That's right, Moon Girl. And here's the thing about leaderships in Marvel Future Fight. The character only needs to be tier 1. So that is a really important thing to consider because later on you'll see some of these characters at tier 1 would only be considered for the leaderships anyways. But Moon Girl's got an amazing 36% all attack to all allies. So she buffs heroes, she buffs villains, she buffs every player in the game. 213 characters can take advantage of Moon Girl's leadership, and that's why it's so good. 36% all attack is nothing to scoff at, and I believe it's exactly the same without her uniform. So she doesn't need anything at all. She's a great character to build up just for that leadership position once you've already got a core cast of damage dealing and support type characters. Coming in at number 9 is Kitty Pryde. Now, Kitty Pryde does not buff nearly as many characters as Moon Girl does. She only buffs 33 characters who are mutants, so 33 is a lot less than 213. I will admit that. It's like 1/7. But instead of giving 36 all attack, she gives 55 all attack and 6% crit rate. That is huge. So you really have to consider that extra number. It's almost 20% more all attack. Actually, yeah, 19% more. And the crit rate really does make it a powerhouse. And it helps Kitty Pryde that a lot of the strongest characters in Marvel Future Fight for both PvE and PvP are already mutants. You know, some of the best tier 3s and just some of the best, strongest characters for clearing content. Coming in at number 8, we have Ronin. Now, Ronin does get a buff on his leadership from his uniform, so keep that in mind. His base is a 36-36 all attack, all defense to universal types. There's only 41 or 42 with Vision universal types in Marvel Future Fight, or I guess 43 if you count Groot. So there's not nearly as many as someone like Moon Girl, but it's more than the mutants. But here's the juicy part. When you get this uniform equipped, he then bumps that stat up to 50% all attack and 36% all defense. That is crazy. Very, very high numbers there. And it's a combination of all attack and all defense, so it is really good. Coming in at number 7, a pretty trashy character, but a very good leadership. I don't know where... Oh, he's at the bottom. Oh, no. Zemo. Baron Zemo. Currently, there are, with uniform swaps, thanks, Mike, 73 villains in Marvel Future Fight. So Baron Zemo applies a 50% attack leadership to all of those 73 characters. That's pretty damn good. There are a few characters in the game that apply 50% all attack to heroes. So this is a very unique leadership, and it's very strong, despite the fact that Baron Zemo himself is pretty trash. Coming in at number 6, we have the big, bad, maddest Titan. His leadership does not change, whether you have any of his uniforms or none of them, if you go OG style from the comics, but it's very, very good, and Thanos has one of the few offensive leaderships that can be used for PvP. It's risky, but you can use it, because on top of the 36-36 all attack, all defense, he applies a 30% decreased debuff duration. Now, you might think, you could value that 50%, the extra 14% all attack of Baron Zemo over the 36% all defense and the 30% debuff duration, because they both apply to villain allies. But in my opinion, it's better to have, a spread. The 30% decreased debuff duration is not a small number. You can really reduce the amount of time that you get stunned or snared or bound or feared or whatever to the point where you almost have debuff immunity like a, Silver Surfer or Jean Grey or Doctor Doom leadership. So very, very scary. And the fact that it combines offense and defense so well for all content, and it applies to 70 plus characters, is really amazing. Coming in at number 5, and this was a tough one. I actually originally had Thanos at number 5 and this character at number 6. We have Cyclops. Now, unlike Thanos, Cyclops does need his uniform to take full advantage of his leadership. If you don't have a uniform for Cyclops, old sad One Eye only goes to 25-25. But once you give him the Phoenix 5 or Marvel Now uniforms, it's either one, he will jump up to 35-25. It's not quite Thanos level, but instead of applying to villains, it applies to all allies. 35-25. That's pretty damn good. Now, you might not need that extra 25%, so in your eyes, if you don't need any defense, this is as good as Moon Girl. So it really is up to your decision making and what you're using the character for, but I do value the 25% all defense. 25% is not a small number. It can be the difference between getting one-shotted and two-shotted, so I do think it deserves mention on here for Cyclops for all characters. Coming in at number 4, a character that is probably easily considered the worst mutant in Marvel Future Fight, we have good old beast Hank McCoy. Hank McCoy also gets a buff on his leadership. The base stat for the leadership is 45% physical attack for all allies, which is nothing impressive. It's the same as Gorgon, it's the same as Goliath. I mean, it's impressive, but it's not top 10 worthy. But once you equip the classic, once you equip Age of Apocalypse, he now bumps up to 50%. Now we're talking. And then when you equip Uncanny X-Men, you get all allies who deal physical damage. So I don't know how many allies that is, but it's a lot. It's over 100. They get 50% physical attack, which is basically the same as 50% all attack for those characters, and 10% crit damage. That is very, very good. And then you have a whole bunch of other stuff that he can do, but that's besides leadership. But yeah, it's a very, very strong leadership. There are no other leaderships in the game that give attack and crit damage. There are some that give crit rate and crit damage. I believe there might be one that gives only crit damage, but I don't think there are any that give attack and crit damage. So that is very, very important. Coming in at number 3, this was originally my number 1, and I think for a lot of people this will be your number 1, but it's Nick Fury. And I'll explain why. It's basically my criteria. I'm only considering his leadership because a tier 1 Nick Fury, and this is important for low spending players or players who just don't have mega tier 2 tickets, they can purchase Nick Fury for 2,500 crystals at tier 1 6 stars, and they can level up his leadership and they can take advantage of that 50% all attack for all hero allies. That's really, really good. That means that Nick Fury buffs 140 characters. Now, I will say this, if you consider tier 2 passives, Nick Fury becomes the number 1 leadership in the game. So that is something to consider. If he's at tier 2 and you are considering tier 2 passives, it's number 1. Because at tier 2, on top of the 50% all attack bonus, he gives you an extra 55% increased damage to supervillains, which is insane. But more than that, he gives you super armor. Giving characters super armor is absolutely busted, especially for PvE content. It is so, so good. It cannot be understated. But I just thought it was really unfair to all these other characters to consider tier 2 passives for him, just to make him better. But I will admit that if we are considering tier 2 passives, then yes, Nick Fury is no questions asked number 1. But because I'm not, he is number 3 on this list. There's nothing wrong with being number 3. Number 3 is really good for the Director of S.H.I.E.L.D., I gotta say. Coming in at number 2, we actually have 2 characters. I know you're gonna get mad, but some of you might get mad, but they basically do exactly the same thing, and it's pretty simple. Hyperion and Ant-Man. They're both universal. One's a hero, one's a villain. They've actually tussled. I believe they've tussled. They've both fought Blue Marvel, I'm sure about that. Anyways, it's pretty simple. 45% all attack to all allies. Easy. It's not the sexiest. It's not the highest number in the game. It's not 65 or 60 or even 55 or even 50. And it doesn't have crit damage or any other fancy stuff, but it applies to all allies, and it applies all attack. So it hits the physicals, it hits the energies, and it hits heroes and villains. So it literally applies to any single character you can think of in the game. It's so easy. If you're ever struggling for a leadership, boom, just grab Hyperion. Boom, just grab Ant-Man. Ant-Man, he's really hard to get. I know, S.H.I.E.L.D. processor, I've been there. Hyperion, you need him at 6 stars for the Corvus Stage 9 requirements to get through Stage 9 Corvus for World Boss. So it's not a bad idea to consider throwing down $10, picking up Hyperion. and using a mega rank up ticket on him, and then using the rest of your bio sub on something else, just to have that 45% leadership if you've already been playing the game for a while and you've invested some money in it. But I wouldn't, be running out the door to get Hyperion anytime soon. But I gotta respect how universally applicable Cosmic Fusion and Anti-Man's leadership are. They're that good. And there's not that much of a difference between like 50 and 45%. These are small numbers. Anyways, you're probably wondering, who the heck is number 1? Oh, you know what? I forgot Viper. On my honorable mention for the 40% poison damage. I mentioned Kid Omega, but I didn't mention Viper. I'm so sorry, baby. Rewind the video. Go play that back. Anyways, the number... I'm playing around, but I did forget her. The number 1 character in the game, the number 1 best leadership in the game is She-Hulk. That's right, She-Hulk. The reason for She-Hulk's leadership being number 1 is that it applies to all allies. Doesn't matter if you're a hero or a villain. Now, it depends who you're fighting. So it's a bit more situational, but it can apply. It applies to most PvE content. It applies to all ABX days that are applicable. It applies to most world bosses except for 1, 2, 3. And on top of that, it is the only sort of unique multiplier. All of the other ones increase your attack, right? Increases energy attack, increases all attack. Notice the wording here. Doesn't increase your attack. It increases your damage dealt. That's right. So the other stats will show up on your details page. If you take a character and you see, oh, my physical attack is 21,900, and then you put Hyperion as the leadership, oh, my attack went up to 25,000. Great. You got 4,000 more physical attack. That's cool. More damage. More damage. When you put She-Hulk as a leadership, you don't notice any change in the stats because She-Hulk doesn't affect your stats. She affects the calculation after when it calculates the damage. And if you know about video game calculation for damage and numbers, it's always good to have an additional multiplier at the end. So that is why She-Hulk's leadership is by far the single best in the game for PvE. She will boost your damage to insane levels. 60%. You better lawyer up because you're gonna get sued, buddy. It's nuts. Keep in mind her leadership does go up with each of her uniforms. She starts off at 48%, and then I believe with this one she goes to 55%. Nope, this one she goes to 55%. Yep. And then she goes up to 60% with the Fantastic Four one. But yeah, She-Hulk is the queen for that reason and that reason only. And she's a pretty decent character with the Fantastic Four uniform. Anyways, whew, that was a long list. That was a long video. Let me know what you think of the top 10 leaderships in Marvel Future Fight. Let me know what you think of the honorable mention. Did I miss any? Is it possible? Do I have to mention 30% HP leaderships? Thank you so much for watching. I'm at PAX right now, and I will see you in the next one. Take care.